Hello, everybody. We're now going to enter the Marystown in Newfoundland and Labrador model ship gallery. And just to quickly introduce you to two people. First one is our cameraman, Christopher Richardson with Cranky Goat Entertainment. And Christopher is the producer, director, writer, editor, and he keeps me employed sometimes. And there he is, his real face. And he's shooting a documentary on the Marystown Ship Gallery for the CBC series Land and Sea, which you can also watch in Ontario. And we're in the amazing, I'm so impressed by this collection, and you're going to see it now, Marystown Ship Gallery, and I'm going to introduce you to Jim Miles.
Today, everyone.
Jim's going to take everybody on your tour, just like we just came in.
Well, certainly. And hello to everyone. We've got quite a bit of variety here. This particular one, the HMS Tartar, that was a British destroyer that was built just before World War II. She's a beautifully built model. Anyone in Hamilton, Ontario can see HMCS Haida, which is a ship of the same class as this one. They were built to be the biggest, strongest destroyers in the world at the time, and when the British built them, that's exactly what they were. But they had a hard war. Of the 16 built, 12 were sunk. So they saw a lot of action during World War II. But now our next ship, a Minesweeper, is much more typical of the sort of thing your average Newfoundlander would have served on. This particular one, the Sir K, you can tell from the look of it, this was actually a fishing ship, a side trawler. Really, all the Navy did when they took it into service, put a gun on the bow, painted her gray. And mostly the men that served on it as a fishing vessel also served on her as a minesweeper. This was described as both at the same time the most boring job in the Navy and the most terrifying. The most boring because you did the same patch of sea every day. 5 miles up, 5 miles back, 5 miles up, 5 miles back. But you were fishing for mines instead of fish, and you had a chance of getting blown sky high at any moment. Risky work indeed. The Royal Navy lost almost 300 of these during the war. So the men that served aboard of them, they may not have gotten the famous actions, but they certainly earned their pay. Our next one would be one of the J-class destroyers of the Royal Navy, so named because all the ships started with the letter J. K in this case, they were king ships. There was Kingston and Kipling and Kandahar and Kelly. Prince Charles's uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, was the captain of HMS Kelly. This particular ship, Kingston, had the infamy of being sunk in dry dock in Malta during an air raid. But they served long and hard, and the Royal Navy certainly got their money's worth out of them.
You see the details on these ships too are amazing. Sometimes you'll see little miniatures of people, sailors on the ships.
Yes, it gives you a sense of scale, how big they really were.
Okay, this is the Ijn I-400, and this is a Japanese ship. And well, Jim will tell you about this one.
Okay.
Yes, the Japanese had some very creative ideas. You don't normally think of aircraft and submarine in the same sentence, but this was a submarine designed to carry 3 aircraft. The wings would fold up, the tail would fold up, and you could actually fit them all in this hangar. Then the big watertight door would close and the submarine would be able to dive. When they were due to be flown off, they'd be pulled out and assembled and then flung off the bow with the catapult. The idea behind it, which was quite clever, was to have these submarines sail to Panama from Japan. They'd fly off their aircraft and they'd be used to destroy the locks in the Panama Canal. That way, everything the American and British navies had in the Atlantic would have to sail around South America, around Cape Horn and back up the other side. Would add weeks to their travel time.
Wow, that's pretty sneaky.
Indeed.
There's the flag, the imperial flag of Japan on the ship.
After the war, the Russians wanted a couple, and the Americans didn't want the Russians to get them because they were full of clever engineering ideas. So the American Navy took all of them off Pearl Harbor and scuttled them in 6,000 feet of water.
Oh,
And speaking of Russian and Soviet Union, there's another Soviet Alpha class submarine. This was made of titanium. Is that right, Jim?
Indeed so. The Soviets wanted to really make a technological leap with these submarines. They wanted a sub that would be able to dive deeper and go faster than the Americans and British, and they achieved that. She could dive maybe 500 feet deeper than the American boats, and she could actually hit 41 knots, which is insanely fast for a submarine. The problem was, in order to get that hull strength, they weren't made from steel. They were built from 3,000 tons of titanium, and they were horribly expensive. The Soviet Union was in deep financial trouble by the time these were launched, and the expense of these things didn't exactly help matters. Now, the drawback was, of course, in order to get that amount of horsepower, they were propelled by an experimental nuclear reactor. And back in the early 1980s, Soviet and experimental nuclear reactor were two you didn't want to hear in the same sentence. Yes, they all went to the scrappers after.
What I find fascinating about this this Soviet submarine is the model maker put all the wear and tear in rust spots. If you can see, it looks like a real submarine. If you see them out at sea,
Yes, with the water line and everything.
yeah, and water line and everything.
Growth. Yeah.
There's a little rust on it, and I'd hate to go and work in a submarine. I'll stick to my bathtub.
give it.
Yeah, commission 1971 to 1981. You want me to hold that?
That's good. We got it.
Okay. There's 100 different models we're going to see in this hour. So we got to, yeah. This is the USS Sea Devil. And Jim will tell us about this sub.
She was one of the Sturgeon class nuclear submarines. They would have been in service during some of the time of that Soviet one we just looked at. They had their sail right here, specially strengthened so they were able to go up through the Arctic ice. There's a famous picture of 3 of these surfaced at the North Pole. They were supposed to be able to bulldoze their way up through 6 or 7 feet of heavy Arctic ice, which I dare say made their engineer nervous. Again, quite a clever paint job on this one to make it look realistic. Both this one and the Soviet one we just looked at are both remote control models as well.
So that means it runs in water and it's ballasted.
You mean inside this is functional?
Oh, yes. Yes,
Oh
indeed.
my.
That Soviet one actually even has a tank in the center. She'll pump herself full of water and sink below the surface of the lake, then pump herself out and rise back up again.
As a miniature.
As a miniature.
Wow. And there's little holes for the water to.
Well, whoever
out.
built that had lots of spare time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh.
Yes, indeed.
Now this one's interesting. We're going to see the USS Nevada. And this is one of the largest submarines ever built. Is that correct?
Quite correct, yes. 560 feet long and 18,000 tons. Very large submarine. A crew of about 150 men on board as well. And her reason for being would be the 24 Trident missiles she carried. So she acted as a nuclear deterrent. Nobody would be able to attack the United States as long as she was still afloat, because she'd fire right back.
And these are all nuclear warheads,
Oh,
multiple
yes.
warheads. And how many were there carrying?
Depends on the year, but I believe there was around 200 warheads in total. So 200 Hiroshimas in one neat little package.
Wow. So this submarine is capable of destroying the world as we know it.
Certainly a major chunk of it, indeed. Now, her role in life was a little different. The 2 submarines we just looked at, their job in wartime would have been to go looking for trouble, to sink enemy ships, enemy submarines. Her job was to stay alive. So they'd go out off the continental shelf in the deep ocean, go down to maybe 500 feet, and basically just do a big racetrack pattern at 2 or 3 knots for 80 or 90 days. Their unofficial motto, "We hide with pride." How's about Canada's very first submarine?
Oh, this is going to be interesting. I had no idea that Canada had a submarine in World War I. And this is it here, commissioned in August 14. There's an interesting story that Jim will tell you about how Canada acquired the submarine.
Yes, this was gotten by unusual means. That submarine was actually intended for the nation of Chile. It was built in the United States, but when it was completed, the Chileans refused to accept the sub because it was too slow. It didn't meet the contract requirements. So the builders put it up on the open market, and the Premier of British Columbia bought it and gave it to the government of Canada, which must have involved some interesting paperwork. Ironically enough, he gave it to Canada roughly 2 weeks before the First World War broke out. So she was commissioned into the Navy and served. But when time came for her to be scrapped, her crew didn't really miss her too much, because while she was good about going underwater, she wasn't really good about coming back up.
Would they have to use a crane to get it back up? Or?
Well, let's just say morale suffered.
Morale suffered.
She was early enough in submarine development, not powered by diesels. Her engines ran on kerosene.
Wow, must have smelled in there.
Indeed.
Not just dirty socks. Wow, this is amazing. This here, the whaler, the whale factory. Sorry about the bumps, everybody. I got us to it. This ship is amazing in detail. I'll do a little pan, and then Jim will point out something. But the ship is not a big model, but it's got something really neat in there that's not rather pleasant either.
It's actually a model of a poor dead whale back on the flensing deck. I'm no fan of commercial whaling. It's an ugly trade, and I'm glad it's disappearing. But I have to admit, the whale factory ships were a clever bit of engineering. And this one is really delicately built with very fine rigging, and an immense amount of work went into the wooden deck. She required a certain amount of repair work when we got her, and it was delicate going because all the lines are so small, so tiny. But she proved to be a nice model afterwards.
I'll just show you the name of the ship, and there's just the baleine, which is a whale in French is baleine. Mm-hmm. So this is a British ship, is that correct?
This one was, yes.
Yeah, and this one came out from the collection that came from Victoria, BC, or Vancouver, is that right?
From Granville Island in BC,
yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
We'll tell you a bit about that, how this whole ship gallery came to be here in Marystown. They just had their first summer open season. Because of COVID, it was delayed by a year, but they've just opened here in a shipbuilding town in Newfoundland. This ship is, this was a whaling ship, right? The MV Setter?
That it is, yeah. That's the one that would actually hunt and kill the whale, and then it would be towed back to the factory ship for processing. Again, an ugly trade, but a well-built ship, because the conditions in the Southern Ocean were very unpleasant indeed, so they had to be tough ships.
This one's
and fast.
Yeah.
Okay. And Jim, what's interesting about this ship? I know there's something rather rude on it too, isn't that right?
Just a little bit. There is a figure of a crewman back on the stern making a, shall we say, rude gesture with his central digit. But this would have been a model of a coal-fired tug from back in the late 1890s.
Yeah, you'll see the fellow there. He has a finger up, standing near the flag. And but the details on this one are amazing.
Oh yes, there's some lovely woodwork into it, indeed.
And it's called the Knight of St. Patrick.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah.
So there would have been a gang of men down here well below the waterline with no portholes, poor ventilation. It would have been about 50 degrees Celsius down there and all the coal dust you could breathe. You'd have a metal shovel and 1.5 tons of coal to shovel during your shift. So the stokers tended to be quiet fellas with big shoulders. This one is one that some of you folks may be aware of because there's been a couple of documentaries about it. This is famous because that little ship was the very first submarine in history to sink an enemy ship. That's the Hunley. More properly, the CSS Hunley, the Confederate States Navy. She was built during the war between the states and was famous for sinking a British frigate. The first time in history a submarine had actually managed to do that. Now, tragically for the crew, the explosion sank them as well. And for 140 years, nobody knew what happened to Hunley and her crew. But about 10 years ago, she was found on the bottom of the harbor, salvaged. The crew was given a military funeral, and she's been put back into view in a museum when they finish the restoration. The intriguing part about her is she was propelled by 6 men on a bench seat turning a hand crank, and that's what turned the propeller.
1881, my gosh.
Yes, yes, indeed.
We had to go down that little hatch. This guy looks quite depressed.
If anybody has any questions, just unmute and shout them out.
Right, certainly.
And then anything else that
Or send them in the chat.
This is an interesting one with something of a Newfoundland connection. That's a German Type 7 U-boat, the most common type of U-boat. Those are the ones that very nearly strangled England to death in the early part of the war by sinking so many merchant ships. They really were an engineering marvel in the early days, but as the war went on, the Allies got more ships, more weapons, more aircraft, so the losses mounted. By the end of the war, the Germans had lost almost 600 of these, and the casualty rate was astoundingly high.
how fast would it go at that? There's a question coming up.
Well, she'd have around 3,000 horsepower. On the surface, they could do almost 18 knots. Submerged, you're probably looking at more like 5 or 6 knots, depending on how quickly they wanted their battery to exhaust.
So they had to come to surface to recharge their batteries, right, with their diesel engines?
Yes, and unlike modern submarines, they couldn't process their air. Once their air was used up, they'd have to surface. So if you kept one of these down for a day, day and a half, you'd force it to the surface in spite of damage because the crew was starting to asphyxiate.
Das quite the boot. Oh,
Quite a bit.
that's the movie, Das Boot. It sure showed life on a U-boat.
It was a great movie.
Great movie. They used models in that movie too.
Quite a lot.
Maybe this was in it. No, I don't know. And this here?
Yeah, there's a Newfoundland connection with this one. That's the larger brother of the one we just saw. This is a Type 9 U-boat. And there's a club in St. John's that has a submarine periscope in it. And it comes from one of these type submarines.
That's the Crow's Nest.
The Crow's Nest Club in St. John's. Once Germany surrendered, these all came to the surface and went into Allied ports. And U-190 was brought into St. John's Harbor. The Canadian government took her into service for a year and a half. And before they scuttled her, they removed the periscope and gave it to the Crow's Nest Club. It's still there to this day. This is an intriguing one. This would have been a dredger on the River Clyde in Scotland back in the 1880s. And the idea was the dredger would bring up the rock and silt and debris from the bottom of the river. And in the estuary, when the tide went out, she'd settle onto the riverbank with her flat bottom. Horses and carts would come out. She'd offload into the carts to be towed away and dumped. You know, it worked after a fashion, but as you can tell, it was very labor intensive. And I'm quite sure the SPCA wouldn't be terribly happy about the condition of the horses.
And this is the other side of that, of the Saxon, the boat that was going the River Clyde. And it's really interesting, this one, when I was looking at it, first of all, I love the details. I'd love to have a boat like this, you know, something about it being really stable, but the smokestack is in front of the bridge where you steer the ship. So as you steer it, you got to kind of glance each side around the smokestack. You got to wash those windows too, I'm sure.
Just a bit.
Yeah. Okay, well, so that's the Saxon. And this is a rail car ferry. Now, I'm just going to mention this one. And because I'm into trains, this is the actual N-scale ferry. There's a little boxcar in the back.
Yes.
So went up the coast of British Columbia. Is that right?
She spent pretty much her entire career ferrying coal cars between Port Mann and the Nemo.
Okay. That's on Vancouver Island. That's the SS Kenora. Okay, what's our next? We got so many. We'll spend. We'll need to do about 5 more virtual walks to do all the boats here. So we have to miss a couple, but Jim?
This particular one, the Veneman, that was one of the last big freighters of the 60s before containers began to take over everything. She was a graceful, fast, large ship in her day, but she'd be dwarfed now by the container ships. They're far larger. They're probably far more economical, but they're not anywhere close to being as pretty.
Yeah. Whenever I see these boats, I want to make, I know I'm being corny, but I just want to, I see the horns, I always want to go,
Yes,
well, that's a light, that's a foghorn. There's no lighthouses
or a
here.
lonely moose.
Yeah, and there's a few ships here.
Well, these are all tugs used by the C-SPAN company, C-SPAN Regent, C-SPAN Monarch. So C-SPAN is a big company still in operation on the West Coast. They do ship handling, salvage, ship tows, barge tows. One of the things they do tow are these huge log barges. They bring the logs to the paper mills and this sort of thing. These barges tend to be very large as well. I mean, you're talking perhaps 120, 130 meters long. And you're crammed full of these very big BC trees, a meter and a half, 2 meters across. So they're loaded using the cranes, which takes a while, of course. But when time comes to unload, it's actually a very clever system. They simply pump out the tanks on the port side, flood the starboard side, the entire barge turns on its side, and everything slides off into the water with a big roar and a splash.
I've seen that in movies when all the logs would roll, the whole barge is splashing.
It's very noisy and
Yeah.
very impressive.
And this is pulled by tugs,
Yes,
like a tug like this one,
yes.
something like that. Okay.
Perhaps a touch larger than that one, but yes, the same idea.
Oh, yeah, that's more for moving the logs once they're floating, right? I
Mhm.
think, yeah. The name, I can't remember the name of those kind of boats. What's next in your? Oh my goodness, something special.
Well, we've got an interesting submarine there. That's Queenfish, an American World War II submarine, including some flags on the back showing the Japanese ship she was claimed as sunk. But she's also a remote control model. You can put that in the pond and steer it around. It goes left to right, slower and faster. But it also raises and lowers the periscope. The radar dish turns. It's even got a speaker inside that plays realistic diesel engine noises. But this particular model was in an episode of The X-Files, that TV show. They used her for some close-ups in an episode they were doing on a haunted ship or something like that.
Is that the only television related model you have here?
The only other one we've got with any screen time would be the Nautilus here. That is a very good reproduction of the Nautilus from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, that Disney movie that was used back in the 50s. Captain Nemo.
Yeah, starring Kirk Douglas,
With the dimple in the chin.
the dimple in the chin,
Mhm.
and Ian Mason
Yes.
as Captain Nemo.
True enough.
I was scared of this when I was a little kid watching the movie, realizing it's not a monster, but the way it used to come through the water would come right at you. Zzz.
And then the giant squid attacking the submarine.
Yeah, but when then you found out that your so-called villain
Yes.
wasn't a villain, and he was an abolitionist.
Made you think.
Yes, and he went to Volcania and he saw that slavery was in full gear. Boy, he was a hero in my eyes, Captain Nemo.
He was a complicated character.
Yeah, he lived in. Well, he had there's his spot.
Yes.
He'd hang out inside there, and I remember he had a pipe organ inside there.
Yes.
He'd play it, but it's very Jules Verne-ish. Well, it is Jules Verne.
Yes.
Speaking of Jules Verne, isn't this the real one from the book?
That is also intended to be the Nautilus from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, but just a different viewpoint. The one we just saw is from the movie. This particular version is somebody's concept of what the Nautilus would look like from the description in the book. And as you see, there's a little bit of difference in the detail. She still has a fishy shape, but she lacks some of the movie embellishments of the other one. Well, this is how we went to sea before the modern screw propeller, a side wheeler.
This is, I'll try and get the sign.
Oh, yes.
See it? I don't know if the chief, it's tilting me around.
Yeah.
The chieftain.
Yes. Now, the side wheeler idea, it did work after a fashion, but you had to carry around a great deal of structure to support and drive the side wheels that you didn't have to do with the propeller. And unfortunately, these tended to beat themselves to death in heavy weather. So if you lost one side wheel, you didn't go at half speed, you spun around in circles like a bulldozer with one track off until somebody with a propeller came out and towed you back to port.
Or you put your sail up,
Or you put your sail up.
which
Yeah.
I don't see on this one, but the early ones.
So the only side wheelers and stern wheelers left now would tend to be the floating casinos on the Mississippi and this sort of business. It's romantic, but it's not terribly efficient. She's a museum ship in Pearl Harbor. This would be the battleship Uss Missouri.
Oh, wow.
Famous because she was the ship that the Japanese surrendered aboard in Tokyo Bay in 1945. Quite the impressive piece. She's 887 feet long, and she's quite a spectacle. Very heavily armed, as you can see. But the Americans did something quite poetic. The Arizona blew up and was sunk during the initial attack on Pearl Harbor when the war started for the Americans. And she lost 1,100 of her crew. So when this one that the Japanese surrendered aboard became a museum ship, they anchored her directly behind the Arizona, the start of the war, the end of the war. And makes quite a statement.
Yeah, it's neat seeing that camouflage too, that I don't see any other models
yes.
here.
Yeah. And that was something that was quite characteristic of them. Makes them stand out. HMS Hood, the famous battle cruiser that blew up fighting the Bismarck in 1941. I think we've all probably heard the Johnny Horton song, Sink the Bismarck. But this is our largest model. She's 13 and a half feet long.
I'll just get a little pan of it here. Yeah, I was in here yesterday filming this thing, and it just took me so long because there's so many details.
Oh, yes.
The Christopher still has to film it. Do you have to film this one, Christopher?
Yeah, I still do.
Yeah, it's going to take you about an hour. It's how long did you say?
13 and a half.
13 and a half feet. Geez, I could fit in that. I'm only 6 feet.
There you go.
So that's amazing. This model just.
She was the pride of the Royal Navy in her day, but unfortunately, when she exploded and sank, the event was so violent that they were only able to save 3 men out of her 1,400-man crew.
And isn't one of those survivors wrote a letter to the model maker?
We actually do have a letter from the last remaining survivor, Mr. Ted Briggs.
Well, let's go see that.
That was written to the model maker, thanking him for sending Mr. Briggs some photos of his model of HMS Hood. I'll just quickly read it for you. Dear Rod, thank you for taking the trouble to send me a copy of the photograph of your model of HMS Hood, which I found fascinating. The amount of patience required for 18 years' work is almost beyond belief and a great tribute to your craftsmanship.
And that's one of the last of the 3 survivors of that sinking.
That is Mr. Briggs at that time, back in 2000. He was the very last of the 1,418 men that fought the Bismarck that May 24th morning.
And I understand you have the Bismarck here too, is that correct?
Indeed. One of our best models. We have the Bismarck alongside the Hood, as is fitting.
Wow.
And much like a Shakespearean play, 3 days after destroying the Hood, Bismarck was sunk herself with very heavy loss of life. So it was quite a painful, bloody week for everybody. But the detail in the model is amazingly good.
Yeah, those guns could shoot over the horizon.
Oh, yes.
Oh, 14
20
miles.
miles.
Yeah.
20 miles, yeah.
And the Hood could only shoot about 12 miles. So they had a big disadvantage.
Well, they were terribly far apart when they fought because of the visibility. But yes, you're quite right. They could chuck shells to 30,000 meters.
You have the ships that sank the Bismarck.
Yes, we actually do have one of those. We've got a model of the British battleship King George V, which along with HMS Rodney sank the Bismarck. That's King George V right over here.
There you go. Those stories all connecting between the battleships.
And actually, that class of ship that King George V belongs to was very busy during the war. Her sister ship, Prince of Wales, brought Churchill to Newfoundland, to Placentia Bay, to sign the Atlantic Charter with President Roosevelt. And another one of her sisters, HMS Duke of York, sank the German battlecruiser Scharnhorst off the North Cape in Norway on Boxing Day in 1943. And that particular fight was in pitch darkness in the middle of a screaming blizzard. Everything was fired by radar, which gives an idea just how incredibly fast the pace of technological change was during the war.
Now, I understand that before this ship could sink the Bismarck, something had to happen that made the Bismarck be a standing duck in the water, a sitting duck.
Yes, the one aircraft model we have right here, that's a swordfish, a biplane torpedo bomber, not terribly different from the World War I aircraft, basically canvas stretched over steel tubing. And out of desperation to slow down the Bismarck, the British launched a dozen of these, and one of them scored a very lucky hit right above Bismarck's rudder, crippled her rudders, so she was only able to wallow into the wind and wait for King George V and Rodney to come up the next morning. So Bismarck had something of a lucky hit and blew up the hood, and the British had something of a lucky hit and crippled the Bismarck. So it seems a very balanced fight overall.
And I was thinking, is the Lion, is that also part of this battle?
No, she was a World War I ship, that one.
Okay, then I'm thinking the Queen Elizabeth.
Queen Elizabeth was in World War II, but just wasn't involved in the Bismarck.
Okay, should we show them that one?
Yes, by all means.
There's something, I just love the bows, the old bows that they plowed in.
Well, she was definitely an older design, but the Queen Elizabeth was built before World War I, and that tough old girl actually survived 2 world wars with the Germans and went to the scrappers in the late 1940s, in spite of being sunk once.
It was sunk already? I mean, it was sunk one time and they brought it up?
Yes, yeah. Some Italian frogmen sank her in Alexandria Harbor, planted explosives underneath her, and blew a 30-foot hole up through her bottom. But Alexandria is shallow, so the British were able to send in divers to close the hatches, pumped her full of air, and took her away to be repaired. She was gone for a year, but when she came back, Italy had surrendered and was now an ally of Britain. So the Italian frogmen that were captured got their medals for sinking the Queen Elizabeth while standing on the deck of the ship they sank. And the captain of the ship they sank pinned the medals on the men who sank his ship. So it was quite a quirky story.
Interesting. It's like, I'm so glad that I did not serve time on these ships.
It's not a fun way to spend your time.
No, I'm just too young. Too young. I'd rather be on a scooter for some reason, fishing.
Yes, quite peacefully so.
There's the Bismarck. That's the Lion, right?
That's Lion right there.
And that's the World War I ship.
Yes, yep. That was Admiral Beatty's flagship at Jutland, the biggest battleship battle in history in 1916. 3 British battle cruisers exploded during the battle and sank, and Lion here very nearly followed. But the man in charge of this turret won the Victoria Cross for ordering the powder magazine to be flooded with seawater after the turret was hit by a German shell. He won the Victoria Cross. Now, giving an order may not sound like a lot to win the Victoria Cross for, but when the shell hit the turret, it blew the roof off. It killed almost the entire crew. And the man, Major Harvey, it blew both his legs off.
Oh, God.
So 2 minutes he had left before he died. He crawled across what was left of his crew, pulled himself up the voice pipe, and gave the order to flood the magazine. So I'd say he earned his medal.
Flooding the magazine saved the ship from exploding. totally.
Yes, yeah, it let seawater in and soak the powder and cover it in seawater. That way later, a few minutes later, when the powder charges that were burning in the elevator system caught fire, there was a big flash, but nothing happened because the seawater had rendered the powder harmless.
The HMCS Dauphin. And it's, Jim, what's unique about the true story of this boat?
Well, as you can see from the figures of the men on the bow, this was a small ship, scarcely 1,000 tons, 17 knots flat out. And these actually were never intended for open ocean work. They were just meant to be escorts around the coast. But things were so bad for the Allies in 1940, she got pressed into ocean duty. She and her sisters would escort the convoys back and forth from Liverpool and the Clyde to Halifax and back. Now, on a nice day in the summer, probably not bad duty. In January, off Iceland in the middle of a screaming blizzard, you've got maybe a foot of ice caked on the bow, you're rolling through 70 degrees. Hard, hard duty. But those grimy, rusty, tired little ships may well have kept Britain from surrendering in 1940. The Germans were sinking so many merchantmen, they were on the brink of starving Britain to death. And they were able to do just enough at the right time to keep Britain in the war.
Pretty tough men.
There's one of these preserved in Halifax, Nova Scotia, HMCS Sackville, the very last of 177 corvettes built. Quite a nice model of the USS Enterprise. Now, for 30 years, she was the longest warship in the world, 1,100 feet long and 5,000 men. She served for 54 years and has only recently been taken out of service. She's in the process of being scrapped now.
What's amazing about this one is they look like CF-18s.
They're
okay.
Yeah.
And in the States, they call them F-18s.
Well, the level of detail is amazing. Yeah. The man's even got individual tail codes on each of the tiny aircraft.
Yeah. And those guns, those can't remember the name of those.
Probably Sea Sparrows.
Yeah, Patriot or
yeah. And we've got the Sea Whiz remote control rapid fire cannon there, the one with a little white dome on it.
And there's a fire truck, a yellow fire truck hidden under the building. The detail's amazing. It's not a big model at all. And we spent a lot of time filming this yesterday or the other day for the documentary. It's just, I don't know, it's fascinating, all the details.
Well, there's a great deal of detail crammed into it, indeed.
And there's too many planes. I don't know how they take off. They have to put some down below.
That's carefully. How they take off.
Yeah, carefully. Yeah.
It's more like an organized dance when you see them moving them around the deck. This is an intriguing model. This is something fairly unusual. Most Navy ships are designed to fight other Navy's ships. This one wasn't. This one was built quickly and cheaply to carry a very large gun removed from a cruiser. And her job was to support the British Army in Flanders. So she'd be providing gunfire support from a few miles off the coast of Belgium. She'd be in communication with a spotter on the ground who would tell her, up 500, left 100, describing where her shells fell and walking them into the target, telling them where to aim to. Now, they were built to be quick to build and inexpensive. So the joke was just enough boat to keep the gun afloat.
Can we show them the Coldwater Cowboys boat?
Yes, by all means.
I worked on this show back in 2014, and I had to get this boat. This is Richard Gillette's model of his boat, the Midnight Shadow, and I had to go up on the top here and put antennas for the microphones, radio mics of the crew. So, yeah, that's what I remember, and then found that here, the Midnight Shadow.
This one was built by a gentleman, just a small community just up the bay from us. And everything that worked on the real ship works on this one. The stabilizers come down, the booms move, the winches turn. So the gentleman spent a great deal of time and effort making sure it was as true to detail as possible.
Yeah, so Coldwater Cowboy still on TV somewhere. Yeah, you'll see my sunrise shots or sunset shots all through there, fishing villages.
Quite pretty ones too. We've got quite a few schooners that were locally built and lent or donated to us by local folks. This particular schooner, the Gertrude El Tivo, she was famous because she was built to beat the Blue Nose, an American schooner with a Newfoundland captain. But this particular one was built 60 years ago by a gentleman from the French island of Saint-Pierre for the Jensen family in Harbor Breton. Mr. Tom Jensen, who's 69, I believe now, donated it to us, and it was brought into his family when he was 8 years old. One of the things we had to do was to cut and fit a new set of sails for her. As you can see, there's quite a bit of rigging involved as well. She's 8 feet tall from the bottom of her keel to the top of her mainmast.
Wow.
Well, those are all new sails put on here in the museum, in the gallery. And then look at the details on the decks. That's what I find neat, is the ropes.
And the dories.
And the dories.
Yes. But now our very next schooner, it's smaller, but she's a lovely example of a working schooner. You can see just how crowded the deck of a working schooner would be. You'd have your dories aboard, but there'd be also trawl tubs, bunches of buoys, fish boxes, splitting tables. There's a great deal of paraphernalia involved in the fishing. So these dories would be dropped off on the Grand Banks with 2 men in each. The schooner would drop off a line of them. They'd go fish all day in their dories, return to the schooner to eat and sleep through the night, and then do it all again the next morning.
Is that where fish and brews came from? I always thought that that's what you'd serve on the boat.
I dare say they did. I imagine a lot of fellas were sick to death of fish by the time they got in.
Probably so.
The brews would be hard bread soaked the night before and then, cooked up with fish.
Free cod, if you're in a schooner, you got all your free cod.
And they'd be leaning toward cod. Yep, definitely.
Yeah.
It was dangerous work, though.
Yeah.
Occasionally, people would get lost in the fog and not be able to find their schooner. If they were lucky, they were picked up by another schooner. But there were cases of 2 men in a dory having to row back to Newfoundland from the Grand Banks. And some of them actually managed it.
I've heard that, yeah.
My father and grandfather fished for 1 season aboard a schooner like this on the Grand Banks. They were gone for 2 months. And for the 2 of them, with 2 months' work, doing something that could get you killed every single day, between the 2 of them, they cleared $380. That was decent money in the day.
Yeah.
And they were strong lads.
Well, back then, I mean, there was no social safety net and very little medical care. You had to be strong. If you were weak or unlucky or you simply died when you were young, there wasn't much choice. This particular one is a very European one. King Louis XIV's Royal Galley. 60 oars, 6 men to an oar, so 360 rowers. King Louis evidently had a little case of conspicuous consumption. He would have been the king who also built the Palace at Versailles.
Let's get a nice wide shot of that, too.
She's a beautiful construction, but even back in King Louis's day, this was not a practical warship anymore. Her time had passed 200 years before. This was more like having a gold-plated Ferrari in your driveway, just a matter of show off to the neighbors kind of deal.
And when I see these ships, they always remind me of centipedes or millipedes.
Yes, and all the legs.
Yeah.
Or that scene in Ben-Hur.
Yeah, Ben-Hur or Three Stooges meet Hercules. Bum, 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 bum.
That's the one.
Ramming speed.
Ramming speed. From the far side of the world, we have this Korean ship called a turtle ship.
This is amazing.
And if you look close, you'll notice she's covered in iron spikes. So one of the times that Japan invaded Korea, the Koreans built these for defending their harbors. The Japanese ships tended to be bigger, so to prevent from being boarded, a forest of iron spikes on the deck would tend to discourage boarders.
I guess that's why they call it the turtle ship, because it's like a turtle.
A hard shell on the top.
Hard shell on the top. What do you know?
Yeah.
And what I find interesting in this is that the stern and the bow
yes.
look like they should be the opposite, but there's the stern, there's
Yep.
the rudder,
There's the rudder. So the bow.
and the bow is almost flat.
Yes.
Gonna come up here.
But now they were never intended to be fast ships, but they were very maneuverable. And of course, if you're fighting in the mouth of a harbor or something, maneuverable is what you want.
Yeah, this ship, I noticed that the ships from China and Korea and that all have their anchors in the bow. I mean,
Yes.
anchors in the bow straight on, not on the side of the bow.
Yes, just
Yeah.
a design feature they stuck with.
Interesting. Anything over here? We have
Well, we have Bounty from Mutiny on the Bounty. Now, that's not one of our largest models, but it's really quite nice. It's very delicately built. And you can get a sense of just how small the real ship was. So that small ship left England and over a course of 5 very tough months managed to sail to the South Pacific. They spent a few months on Tahiti gathering breadfruit, and when they went to go back, the bad food and flogging started again. So the crew mutinied and stranded Captain Bligh and the loyal men in that one open boat in the middle of the South Pacific. Now the captain, he may have been a very unpleasant person, but he was a fine navigator. In that open boat, just with a hand compass, a sextant, and a few charts, he sailed 3,000 miles to Timor in the Dutch East Indies and only lost one way.
And just to show you, like, this ship is full of details. You think it's bigger, but there's my hand next to it. I always think you could build that one in a bottle if you're skilled at it.
Just need a really big bottle.
You need it. Yeah. If I could build a ship in a bottle,
Yeah.
first thing I would do, I get a hull, I get it. Or anyway, enough of that.
Oh, yes.
There's the USS Constitution.
Old Ironsides.
Oh,
230 some years old and still afloat in Boston Harbor. You can visit her if you're ever in Boston. 21 inches thick of oak, 3 layers of 7-inch plank.
and that oak was so unique that the shells would just bounce off.
Yes, indeed. During the War of 1812, some of the British cannon shot were seen to bounce from her hull.
I'm just going to circle around it here. Again, the rigging is amazing. A lot of these ships, when they came out from Vancouver, because they were donated to Marystown, because it's one of the few shipbuilding towns in Canada. And the interesting story is that these fellows, including Jim and others here, restored a lot of these. They were in bad shape, some of them. They came in cases.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they all needed a good cleaning, but some needed a bit of repair. But one of the amazing ones, our best one in the gallery really, needed very little repair, which is amazing. This piece of work, the Waffenbon Hamburg, she was built by a German master model maker 56 years ago, sent from Germany to British Columbia, then British Columbia to here in the back of a transport truck. And when we got her, the only thing we had to repair, there were 2 broken lines and 1 little gun port lid was off. We had to put back. Now, when you consider the amount of travel and the fact that it's 56 years old, that's a bit miraculous, really.
Yeah.
And she's a beautiful piece of work. You can see the level of detail as...
I'm going to try and get in as close as I can to some of this detail without hitting the glass. When we were filming for Land and Sea, of course, we have the benefit of taking the glass off so we can get our camera lens quite close to these details. So I'm just sort of on the edge of the glass here. But you see the beautiful colors?
And the rigging. The rigging indeed is enough to give you the heebie-jeebies.
Yeah. And I'm going to, in here, what we were filming with the other day was the insides. You'll see the insides have actually chairs and tables. And that what I just learned today is that the builder, when he built this model, built the chairs and tables first and then built the model around those details. It's just amazing. And just this is called the Waffenbon Hamburg. Okay, so it's named after Hamburg, Germany.
Built to defend their merchant ships from pirates on the run to Portugal and Spain.
Wow. So this ship is just beautiful model.
It's just gorgeous.
We lit it up for the show. Christopher put lights in it, and we got some beautiful shots for the land scene. I'm going to show you the stern here, and I'm trying to go as close as I can, but you'll see there's actually soldiers with swords carved. Those aren't like, they're not the crewmen. That's the carving. So the
They would have been around 10 feet tall.
Yeah.
Scale.
yeah, in scale. But you see all the lions and the castle, the coat of arms, and even the lanterns you'll see on this. It is like what people say, the Spanish galleons from the same era, reminiscent of that time.
Now, this would have been the later 1600s. This would have been around the same time period as those Pirates of the Caribbean movies.
Okay. A lot of guns, isn't it? I don't see Johnny Depp. Just to look at the details, and there's even a ship's boat right there, midship, and there's ropes all over the place. The rigging is every detail.
If you went there, you'd have to spend a week to see everything and absorb all the detail.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're really into this, is I'd safely say like the best collection in Canada, or you would say one in the top of the world. I mean, I know
It's a pretty impressive collection.
Yeah.
I don't really have the details to compare to anything else, but it's pretty impressive. Yes. With our Hood, our biggest one, HMS Hood, there's only supposed to be one other one in the world at that same 1/64th scale, that same size, and that's in the Museum of Transportation in Glasgow. So we're fairly rare, I'll put it that way.
I believe you. This is totally amazing.
There's just so much here. It's unbelievable.
It's incredible. I mean, we had one of the questions, is shipbuilding a fine art? And I think if you come to this museum, that question gets answered, because there is incredible art that you would say you would compare to that in the famous galleries of the world. This, if anybody knows about Canada's centennial, they built a model. I don't know if that's a Bay Company built it or what, of the Nonsuch. And this is a very interesting ship.
Yes, that one little ship would have been really the start of the Hudson's Bay Company, which, of course, for centuries was a very powerful entity, but it all began with that one little ship.
And it was built so that it could be pulled up on land, easy. It's a very small boat. And I know they built the replica. This is just the model. And somebody I know, they said during that time, when he was a young fellow, he got to board the Nonsuch, and they fired flour out of for cannons. There's a question here: how many models in the museum?
Well, now we have some put to one side in the back because we circulate them. But out here on the floor, where everybody can see, there's currently about 105, isn't it? Yes, roughly 105 are out in the main viewing area, open to the public.
Wow.
Yeah. And another person works here at the museum. I'll just introduce you to Carrie. And just say hello to everybody in Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto.
Hello.
Hi, Carrie.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, sir.
And they're just saying hello to you, and John is saying hello.
Welcome to our museum of little boats.
Yeah. We just interviewed Carrie for Land and Sea. So you have to watch Land and Sea when it comes to Central Canada, because you look for the episode, and Carrie's one of the interviews we just did. The schooners all lined up.
That's a good shot to end on right there.
Yeah, the schooners here. So I thought that would be a nice shot, So to the Marystown Ship Gallery.
Turn your camera around, let everybody see.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And here we all are. And so thank you for coming to visit the Marystown Ship Gallery. It's wonderful. And thank you, Jim, for your tour.
This is well worth it.
So
And
on
thank you,
behalf of
everybody.
Sunnybrook and the veterans here, thank you so much to both Jim and Peter for hosting today and showing us all the wonderful display at the museum. And John for organizing this. And thank you so much.
Yeah, Virtual Photo Walks is really happy to do this, and we'll be doing more shows in the next couple of weeks.